Hello everyone, is Bringonthechaos Glizzy for another What If Beerus is an Olympian god of destruction. Beerus has been erased because of the mistake Goku, but he encountered the fathers of all angels. He is in a new world field of gods. What will happen to our former G.O.D?
Chapter 25. The Olympian God of Destruction. Chapter 25. The Titanomachy 18. Roughly 2 days later, atop Mount Othries. Groan leaving their lips from lingering, phantom pain, brown eyes slowly peeled open. A world of darkness being steadily replaced with one of a blurry ceiling before walls and a fuzzier floor, as the groggy gaze of the waking Titan drooped down to the side. Head tilting as it felt for a moment like the divine brain was swimming in their skull. Ah. You're finally awake again, my son. A familiar voice called near him, and the Titan turned his head once again to his other side, where he could make out a fuzzy, but certainly muscular figure, having all but leapt out of their seat as they moved up closer to him. Good to see you're already getting up and about. Last abysmal memory I can recall of enduring something similar to what you did, I was out for twice as long. What happened? The Titan questioned, holding his head with his hand as he slowly rose up to a sitting position on whatever it was he was lying on. A bed. He didn't recall ever going to one. Matter of fact, for a moment, he wasn't even sure what he'd been doing before this, as his vision came more into focus. You got eviscerated, Atlas. Iapetus replied with an angered tone, as his features came properly into view, along with the room they were in as the fuzziness of the muscle-bound Titan's vision receded. The older Titan standing by what was most definitely his bedside, as he laid a hand on his bulky shoulder. Your mind likely still hasn't caught up due to how quickly it all happened, but the shortened end of it is, you were interrupted just as you tried to enter into your true divine form on the battlefield by two of Cronus' sons. The first running you through with his trident, and then the other blasting you into bloody mist with an unbelievably powerful, divine thunderbolt. Ugh, Atlas blinked, feeling a bit of a migraine coming on as he shook his head. The memories of the battle that he and the rest of Cronus' forces had commenced against Beerus and his allies' stronghold slowly flooding back into his mind, albeit in a fuzzy manner. From its disastrous beginnings, to the flash of light he'd seen from above, just before everything had gone dark for him. I believe I recall as such. But then, why do you act like I've been out for a while, if that's the case? Surely, I would have regenerated quickly. Iapetus finished for him, getting a nod from his son, and a sigh from himself. Well, provided those weapons used against you didn't have any unique ability to keep you down for longer, you would have. However, as if that wasn't enough, before your body could even have a chance to reconstitute itself, your bloody mist was smashed into and carried away into the deep depths of Oceanus's domain by a space-crumpling boulder hurled by one of the Hecatonchires. That's why you didn't do so immediately. And all that compounded together is why you've been out of commission for over 2 days now, my son. 2 days. Atlas looked aghast. How could I have been out for that long? Not even being knocked out of our ascended states causes such a long period of unconsciousness. You'd have been out a lot longer had I not fished you out of the ocean as fast as I did. Had to end up bringing the damn boulder to Othries with me through dematerializing with it, seeing as it wouldn't stop rapidly sinking. Could only keep up with it by temporarily going into my true divine form, but that's neither here nor there. Iapetus waved that off, before narrowing his eyes at his son. I don't know why you're so shocked at it being a few days though. I distinctly remember that I did warn you already of the threat the hundred-handed ones posed in as much detail as I could before the siege. You did? Atlas asked, now sounding and looking genuinely confused. His mind attempting to remember such a thing, only to be met with what might as well have been static. Are you certain of that, Father? Because I don't recall you ever doing that. You what? Iapetus appeared shocked. What do you mean you don't recall? I only told you about just how dangerous they could be a matter of weeks ago, my boy. If this were your brother Menoetios, I wouldn't bat an eye, but you. Your memory is typically impeccable, even for meaningless things that happened during the earliest days of your childhood, and you're telling me that something as important as the information about the Hecatonchires, which was told to you recently, has somehow left you. I suppose it has, Atlas replied awkwardly, not sure what else he could have said, as he wasn't about to lie to him and say that it hadn't. I'd love to tell you otherwise, Father, but I can't. He said while clutching his head just a little harder, as though that might help rack his brain better for that memory. Matter of fact, thinking back on that battle, and even the build-up to it, there's some fuzziness there as well in a number of places. I can't remember who I was even fighting before I got taken out. This is sounding less like he forgot, and more like his memory got damaged somehow, Iapetus thought to himself in concern. His watchful eyes spotting his son's body making the occasional, harsh twitch. And he could swear that as he did, he saw the faint flickers of electricity zipping off his frame, as though he were one of those weak animals down below getting over the aftermath of a lightning strike. Damn. It appeared as though the weapon of Cronus youngest might have been causing this, and he felt mildly stupid for being even remotely surprised by that. It had been forged by the Cyclopes, after all. Of course, it'd have some kind of side effects on his boy after the horrendous shock obliteration it had dealt him. Which meant that that trident probably would too, with their luck. He'd absolutely need to share this information with Kronos. This was something he'd need to know, in case he ended up facing that son of his in the future again. How many of our forces were able to come back with us in the retreat, then? Iapetus was snapped out of his thoughts as Atlas asked another question that he should have well known the answer to. Did any of them make it back? No, Atlas, they didn't. Me, Krios, Koios, Thea, and of course, Lord Kronos, were the only ones that made it back. Iapetus shook his head, some frustration at such an outcome boiling to the fore, but he kept a tight leash on his emotions, maintaining a mostly stoic expression. And honestly, I'm not sure whether it was foolish mercy, a lack of care, or just not knowing I had gone there that had 'em not doing so, but had the Hecatonchires acted once I went to get you back, we probably wouldn't be here right now. The siege was that much of a failure for us. I see. That is definitely disconcerting. Atlas remarked while staring down at his lap in thought, floored by the idea they'd been repelled that hard. It looks like we severely underestimated our enemy, if that's the case. I can't imagine Lord Kronos is happy about this. Oh no, he was downright furious when we got back. Still is now, to an extent. The elder Titan sighed. He knew better than to try and attack again without a proper plan, especially with you temporarily out of commission. He's just been sat there, on the throne he took from our father, for quite some time. Both angrily deliberating on what we should do next, and also keeping a lookout in case any of the other gods get the bright idea to try and go to our opposition. Or if the Hecatonchires decide to take matters into their own hands and attack us. Can't say I blame him. The younger, muscle-bound Titan replied with a sigh of his own, before aggravated veins began to show on his temple, as his hands balled into fists. I can feel anger beginning to pump through my veins as we speak, and I struggle to remember what even happened. I can only imagine how much he must be fuming at such an abysmal loss that you so describe, Father. With that said, he swung his massive legs over the opposite side of the bed and made to stand up, as his father let go of his shoulder. Once his feet touched down though and bared his weight, he ended up having to brace himself against the wall for a brief moment, as his body began feeling bizarre tremors like he was a landmass and an earthquake was happening within him. His powerful fingers digging into the rocky surface as he shook, before he was able to stabilize himself through sheer force of will. Shaking off the seemingly random quaking of his form before it could potentially put him on his hands and knees. His father, of course, had caught this happening, and gave him a small look of concern. Easy there, my son. The defeat you suffered is different from the ones you suffered at my hand during our spars when you were younger. The effects of it are still lingering with you even now, so it's probably best if you take it easy for a bit. Ha! You should know well he won't listen to that one, Father. Atlas has always been ever the stubborn one, more so than any of us. The new, deep male voice brought both Titans' attention to the doorway, where someone they both knew all too well stood, leaning a forearm over the frame, as he looked in at them with an amused, but arrogant smile. His hair a near pitch black and long enough to reach down to his shoulders, with eyes a darker shade of brown than Atlas' own. His jawline just as well sculpted and muscular as the aforementioned Titans, whilst missing a beard to call his own, as he stood there in an identical tunic. His height rivaling his as well, and easily as big as him too, with his body being built with enough ferocious muscles mass that his biceps, even at rest, practically bulged with deep veins, and his bulky shoulders rose higher than even Atlas did. Ah! Menoitios, Iapetus greeted with a small nod of acknowledgement, but inwardly groaned at the appearance of his second eldest son. He must have been losing his touch, if he didn't notice the younger Titan until he'd announced his presence. How long have you been there, exactly? Long enough to overhear everything, Father. Menoitios said as he sauntered in like he owned the place. His presence giving Atlas an annoyed visage as he came up to him. And I must say, I'm quite surprised to hear just how badly you got battered out there, Atlas. I expected more from you, brother. Especially seeing as Father made sure I stayed behind, rather than join you all in the siege. The Titan snorted. And look at how well that turned out, eh? You lot failing to take out a bunch of pathetic rebels and even more pathetic traitors. How embarrassing. Watch your mouth, my son. Iapetus warned, already able to see where this was going. Our enemy is far more dangerous than you give them credit for. It is unwise to underestimate them. Pa. You're overblowing it, Father. The Titan downplayed instantly, waving a dismissive hand at his parents' words, refusing to believe he was doing any such thing as he then cockily jutted a thumb toward his chest. If you'd not been dumb and allowed me to come with you, that siege would have gone completely different from how it went. Rather than come back empty-handed and missing most of the army, we'd have come back with this whole skirmish ended. HMPH. Just as delusional as always, I see. Atlas grunted in vexation, as he partially glared at his overly confident brother. If we were beaten back like this, with pretty much all of our best forces taking part, then your presence wouldn't have made a damn difference, little brother. If anything, you'd have only got in the way with your brash antics. So says the great general handpicked by our king, who got trounced the hardest from the looks of things. Menoitios scoffed, leaning towards Atlas' face as he planted his huge hands on his hips. Stabbed, blasted and then smashed by a boulder all the way to the deep depths of the boundless ocean. Ended up having to rely on our father to save your ass, and you think you're in any position to talk shit about me after that? A violent red aura slowly began to permeate around his hulking form, as he let out a sneer. If you ask me, the only one being delusional right now, is you, dear brother. NNGH. Atlas let out an exasperated breath, before shaking his head and ridding himself of the urge to smack his flesh and blood over the head. That'd only start a brawl, and he couldn't be bothered dealing with that right now. Tell yourself whatever you want, Menoitios. I don't care what you think, and I certainly couldn't care less how much you want to drown in your own hubris. He spoke annoyedly while place a hand on his younger sibling's shoulder. Now, if you will, get out of my way. I am awake now, and must inform Lord Kronos of such, before we get back to the pressing matter of how we shall deal with the rebels. Haha. Your head must still be reeling from the failed siege, brother. Did you forget you could just dematerialize out of here? Or is trying to shove me aside your way of making yourself feel a little better after that travesty you barely came back from? The younger sibling shot back, grabbing Atlas' wrist and forcing the hand away from his shoulder with another sneer. In any case, you're in no position to be ordering me around, so keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you. And if you know what's good for you, you'll quit it with your infuriating behavior in my presence here and now, before I bury you beneath O3s for being such an obnoxious annoyance. The older sibling shot back angrily, even more veins starting to pop out of his temple, as he felt his self-control beginning to slip despite his best efforts to keep it in place. The Titan once again holding sturdy against the bizarre tremors running through his body, barely even noticing the licks of electricity still appearing around his body, as he glared a hole through Menoitios' head. Menoitios simply glared right back, totally unperturbed by the threat, as he brought a hand up near his and Atlas' features, before making a "bring it" motion toward himself. Go ahead and try it, you lumbering oaf. I'll be sure to batter you all around O3s as soon as you make a move. Batter me. Atlas laughed. His own aura finally permeating over his frame as well, crackling against his siblings as they were practically in each other's faces by this point. You could barely keep up with me back when we sparred, and now all of a sudden you think you could batter me. Well, if a bunch of measly rebels could bring you so low these days, brother, then I'd say I'll have no problem beating you into a bloody pulp. Oh, my ass you why. Boys. Iapetus raised his voice with a slowly rising cold fury and further mounting frustration, bringing his two sons' attention to him, as he crossed his arms. Feeling like he was back in the early years, when they were both but little brats that did nothing other than fight each other over the dumbest of things, because neither was willing to budge, and he had to be the one trying to instill discipline into them. Lest they make complete fools of themselves. Calm yourselves. This is not the time for you both to be quarreling childishly. We are at war right now, and the last thing we need, especially after everything that's just happened, is to be needlessly at each other's throats. Some of Atlas' vexation vanished, being replaced with a tinge of shame at his father's words, and how easily he'd allowed himself to be swept in and aggravated by his younger kin, as he made his aura dissipate. Apologies, father. You're right. Now's not the time for us to be squabbling pettily. HMPH. Whatever. Menoitios shrugged dismissively, an act which ticked off Atlas, as the younger of the two let his aura fade as well. I'm honestly much more interested in learning for myself why whatever those Hecatonchire things did to you, was able to keep you out of commission this long. Because from the sounds of it, they seem like the only potential threat on the opposing side, if you ask me. There is no potential there, my son. They are a threat. The biggest one against us, even, and are the main reason we failed to take out the rebels. Iapetus stated with the utmost seriousness. And seeing as you seem dead set on joining us, regardless of what we say now, and also because your brother seems to be suffering some problems with his memory, I shall enlighten you both as to why. I'm listening. Menoetios, for once, said back in a more cooperative fashion, which Atlas nodded along to. The Hecatonchires, your uncles, for lack of a better word, outside calling them monstrous beasts, not only have the kind of raw power that most of us, even at our peaks, cannot equal. They are also capable of disrupting our ability to heal with any one of their attacks that either crumple, or rend through space-time itself. How do you mean they disrupt it? Atlas asked in confusion. My memories of the siege may be fuzzy, but I do still vaguely recall you and my uncles getting hit by them, and I don't believe you had any issue regenerating the damage caused, unless I'm missing something here. That's because it's only effective under specific circumstances. That being, when you're knocked out of your ascended state, or knocked out as you're about to go into your ascended state. He explained, before going further, as he could foresee the question about to be raised by his sons. And in case you're wondering, whilst it's not very well known, due to how rarely it actually happens, being rendered unconscious as you're on the cusp of ascension has the same backlash effect of prolonged unconsciousness as when you're knocked out of the ascended state. Both younger Titans nodded, intrigued by this new tidbit of information. Or well, new in Menoetios' case, anyway. He'd told Atlas of this before, as well, but he'd forgotten that too, it seemed. With that in mind, my sons, the way it can disrupt our healing ability is simple. Outside of squashing us beneath them and leaving no room for escape, that crumpled or rendered space-time that their attacks, hurled boulders in this case, caused to happen. For reasons I'm not too sure of myself, they interfere with the recovery period before we are able to wake, and end up causing the time before we wake up to increase dramatically from what it should be. Atlas appeared deeply concerned by this information, just as he had the first time Iapetus had told him of it. The lapse in memory wasn't his fault though, so Iapetus was willing to let that and any other one go. Meanwhile, Menoetios whistled, sounding quite impressed by that, but also, predictably, and concerningly, did not look worried, as he simply asked. And how did you know about this beforehand? Have any personal experience, father? Iapetus grimaced at that, but obliged to answer regardless. Back in the old days, before our father wanted rid of us, because we were revolting him with our mere presence, me and my brothers got involved in the occasional tussle with our larger siblings. It looked like even just admitting their relation repulsed him. Atlas had yet to see any of them directly, as had Menoetios, but from the way their father had spoken of them, Atlas got the feeling they must have looked like hideous monsters that only a mother could love. And Gia no doubt had, otherwise she would have never bothered getting help to break them out of Tartarus in the first place. Suffice to say, Iapetus continued. I let my guard down during one of those altercations while I was ascending, and as I've told your brother Atlas once before, I paid the price for it. Ended up getting crushed by one of them and losing consciousness. By the time I'd awoke, and was fully healed, roughly 4 days had passed by with me having been laid out in the same spot. Only found out that was the case due to mother informing me I'd been out that long, otherwise, I wouldn't have thought I'd been out any longer than was typical. Which was how he knew they'd gotten off easy in that failed siege. The Hecatonchirs, despite doing this multiple times, had never actually been aware that this was happening, and moreover, it made Kronos' decision to arrive there first in their base forms a very wise one indeed. Huh. Well, I guess that's good to know. The cocky, dark-haired Titan grinned. And now that I know of all this, dealing with those Hecatonchirs shouldn't be too hard, and taking out those rebels should be even easier. Did you not hear a single word he just said? Atlas remarked with irritation, as he turned to his brother with a displeased, incredulous glare. What our father just told you, if anything, should have made it clear to you just how much harder it'll actually be taking him on, as opposed to how you initially, and stupidly thought. But yet somehow, you think that makes things easier. Perhaps to you, it would, seeing as you were defeated by them. As for me though, I'll learn from your mistakes, and when I go out to the battlefield with you all the next time you leave, I'll be sure to show you all why it was a mistake leaving me behind, when I crush those rebels to bits with my own 2 hands. He exclaimed with extreme levels of confidence, which were most assuredly misplaced. Heck, they should bring me their leader, that eldest son of Kronos, just to save us all some time, and I'll personally hand his broken body over to him after I'm finished. Either way, should be fun. Ha 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 ha. He finished while throwing his head back in laughter. Neither his brother or his father were in the least bit amused. The former simply scowling at him, while the latter ran a hand down his face in exasperation. Ah. You lot better be ready soon though. Because you know how much I hate waiting. Menoetios commented, as his laughter died down. The younger Titan not even bothering to pay either of his family members any mind, as he turned and began making his way out of the room. That idiot is going to get himself eviscerated even harder than I was. I can already see it now, Atlas muttered just as his younger brother was out of earshot, shaking his head in dismay, before turning to his father with a sigh. I'd honestly rather my own daughters join us instead, despite the fact that none of them are combatants. At the very least, little Calypso, the Pleiades and my dear Hesperides could properly follow instructions. Careful what you wish for, Atlas. With the fact that we lost the rest of our army in that botched attempt at a siege, I could very well see Kronos pulling from as many of our remaining allies as possible, even if just to act as fodder to keep the other side distracted. Your children are of no exception to that. Iapetus warned, knowing that in truth, his son didn't want his own children anywhere near this clusterfuck of a war, if he could help it. I'm aware. The muscle-bound Titan frowned. Calypso's probably a guarantee already, now that I think about it. She's been the most vocal in her support of me and the rest of you, and unlike her half-sisters, she'd probably jump at the opportunity to help as much as she could, if given to her. Whereas my other daughters would be far more hesitant of getting involved physically in this. And he didn't blame them one bit for that. Especially not after the apparent thrashing he'd taken against the rebellious gods. This situation truly is most unfavorable. Well, not much else we can do, unfortunately. Iapetus shrugged, before gaining a deeply troubled expression. My only hope right now is that that younger brother of yours doesn't grow impatient too quickly, as he's been wont to do before, and attempts to strike out at the enemy on his own. Atlas snorted at the thought. Such a reckless, brash act would fit him well. Even if they took the Hecatonchirs out of the equation, there was still no way his overconfident sibling wouldn't get folded by the enemy side if he tried to take them on single-handedly. Honestly, even if he managed to get Beerus in a one-on-one, it would still end very badly for him, unless he took it seriously and was in his ascended state straight away. Speaking of Beerus, one of the things he did remember with clarity about the siege was that Beerus had never participated in the defense of their stronghold. He knew not, as of yet, why that was, but he was sure of one thing regarding the young god who'd made such an impact within so short a period of time. When he did become active again, there was sure to be even more trouble. Meanwhile, atop Mount Olympus. NGHN, Beerus stirred, his eyes slowly, heavily, peeling open blearily. His vision foggy as his crusty eyelids flitted back and forth as they adjusted to light once more. The wonderful caress of sleep attempting to pull him back in even as he slowly awoke, just as it had done many times before upon waking up from his slumbers in Universe 7. The allure was hard to resist, especially with how majestically soft and warm his pillows felt against his face, as it was pushed into them. Their embrace coaxing him further to keep himself still and relax into the pliant plushness and close his eyes once more. For they were easily the softest and comfiest he'd ever had, to the point he had to wonder if the Cyclops hadn't gone and replaced his previous ones, which had already been the best beforehand, with superior cushions for his head to peacefully slumber on without a care in the world. Sleeping a little longer wouldn't hurt, Beerus thought sleepily to himself, about ready to fold and give into the realm of dreams once again, as he snuggled up more to whatever he was holding on to. Had he been given something to hold onto in his sleep as well? Because with how amazing and warm it felt up against it, he knew well it couldn't be his bed sheets. He also felt he was on his side, and that strangely, the pillows pressing into his face were somehow turned with him, and seemingly able to remain perfectly comfy despite his position, but he didn't question it. He was too groggy too, and it was probably magic anyway, he rationalized. Damn, he mumbled, as he appreciatively rubbed his face deep into the silky smooth pillows squishing so wonderfully, and dare he say, divinely, over his features, as he coiled his legs around the bottom portion of whatever plump, shapely object he was given. The god of destruction shoving his face even deeper, one might even say greedily, as he ground his nose, his chin, his cheeks, and even his temple into their sublimely supple hold. These pillows are, wah. Incredible, he yawned deeply, inhaling the heavenly scent of the doughy duo as he did, feeling them roll and bulge out around his rubbing face without resistance like they were made of the softest jelly, yet firm enough to where they could hold him with ease. All as he hugged himself as close as possible to them and whatever the other thing was that his body was now pushing up against. I could sleep on these for eons. Is that so? Beerus's body stilled immediately, as he heard a low, feminine voice moan back teasingly above his head. One that he recognized, and part of him hoped he imagined due to still being in a haze from his amazing slumber. However, the melodic voice continued, sounding quite smug as it did. That's quite the compliment from you. I'm flattered to hear you enjoy sleeping on my pillows that much. At this, Beerus, previously heavy eyes snapped open as he turned his face over the squishy pillows to look up. His wide amber eyes meeting the amused, almost sultry-looking hazel eyes of Hera as she smiled down at him knowingly, seeming to take a good deal of pleasure at whatever shocked, goggled expression he must have been making. Hello, dear brother. Good to see you're finally awake. His younger sister said honestly, though with a definite hint of playful satisfaction as she saw the realization of where, or rather, whom, he was currently resting on steadily dawn on him. one of her hands choosing that moment to caress his long, purple hair in what he took to be a cheeky manner, as she gave him a saucy wink. I assume you must have had some sweet dreams while you were out, given how much cuddling you did with me up to now. It took a moment for Beerus's sleep-addled mind to fully process what was going on here, as his wide eyes shifted from Hera's beatific, smiling visage to where his face was shoved into. The god finally noting the absence of actual pillows and the presence of two perfectly perky, pancaked breasts bulging and seeping out around his features, with his peripheral vision able to catch one of her stiff, dusty pink nipples grazing along the outer edge of his cheek. Once the cogs in his brain started fully chugging along, they did so at a rapid pace as any idea of sleep left his mind instantly. The god now becoming acutely aware of the fact that his arms and legs were firmly coiled his smug sister's waist and legs, as though he was doing everything in his power to keep her by him, and there was no questioning how intimate this looked, especially with his face buried in her cleavage the way that it was. When this all eventually registered for him, the god of destruction felt the immediate urge to recoil back from her in outrage, now distinctly aware of what his face was actually pressed into and what he'd actually been hugging his body into this whole time, but he snuffed that out almost as fast as it had risen. And not because of that blasted part of him that was loving such closeness with her and pleading with him to take it further, but because he knew that was probably the reaction she was looking for in this situation. Instead, he narrowed his eyes, trying, perhaps futilely, to contain his growl as he found his voice finally. The god making sure to temper himself and ensure he was controlled enough this time so he didn't stutter like an imbecile, as he glared up at the smiling goddess. Hera, would you care to explain why you are here and holding me like this? If Hera was in any way surprised by his lack of outburst this time to such a compromising position, she did a phenomenal job of not letting it show, as she chuckled down at him. The vibrations of which his face could feel off her billowing boob flesh as her chest rose and fell, something he found much more attractive than he should have, even taking into account his acknowledgement of DNA being non-existent with them. I was merely here to keep you company while you recovered, dear brother. Was that not obvious? She replied back with an arched, regal brow, as his own twitched. Because no matter how much Beerus wanted to call bullshit on that, there was not even a shred of deceit in her words. You kept to your word when taking out Hyperion for me, so I thought I'd return the favor in a way I believed you'd appreciate. Appreciate. Beerus was almost lost for words, astounded even, at that reply. What made you think I'd appreciate this? Come now, Beerus. Do you really want me to spell that out for you? Before Beerus could think to ask what the hell she was talking about, his thoughts suddenly ground to a halt briefly, as he finally took notice of a particular part of his godly anatomy. How it had an abnormally high flow of ichor running through it, and stood up with treacherous tautness pressing through the fabric of his tunic, and given their closeness, undeniably rubbing and prodding against Hera's inner thighs as it pushed out the other side. Damn it, the exasperated words tumbled out in an aggravated murmur before the destroyer god could stop them. This infernal body had betrayed him again. I see you get it now. Hera giggled in a somewhat victorious way. And I must say, you've got quite the vitality. That third leg of yours has been like that since I brought you here a few days ago. Once again, Beerus wanted to call bullshit and say she was just mentioning that to mess with him. But it was that infuriating honesty in her words that kept him from doing so, no matter the urge. The reality he had to accept, and had accepted already, was that his body in this reality was just that bloody horny, no matter how much he may have wanted it to be otherwise. And as for the second part of your earlier question, she tilted her head at him foxily. You were the one who fell into my bosom after losing consciousness, and when I materialized us unto your bed, before I could lay you down properly for rest, you chose to wrap your arms around my waist to keep me by your side. And after everything you'd done, I'm afraid I just didn't have the heart to extricate you from me, and simply did my best to get comfortable until you woke. This time, Beerus sensed a definitive lie in there, but he didn't get the chance to call her out on it before she'd pressed on with a cunning smile. So then, with that said, might I ask you why you're still clinging unto me so daringly, dear brother? Hera asked with a pointed, almost predatorial gaze. Is there perhaps something you're not telling me, which your body is trying to convey on its own? Beerus, despite his best efforts, couldn't stop his expression from contorting and looking like he'd just sucked on a particularly sour lemon. Something which unfortunately, Hera caught, and didn't fail to capitalize on further, before he could change that. I'm correct, aren't I? She said with a smug look, making a shadow cast over Beerus's eyes as his teeth grit down, looking much more conflicted than he'd probably ever admit to her. Something that only solidified that he was indeed attracted to her, no matter what he said. His arms and legs, at least to her, finally beginning to unwind from her figure with what seemed to be an almost instinctive reluctance. Either because he'd only just now realized he himself was more guilty of what he accused her of, or because secretly he was hoping she just wouldn't notice. Either one suited her, and inwardly, made her feel somewhat more aroused. You're really smitten with me, aren't you? All right. Screw this. Beerus thought to himself in aggravation, as his patience, along with something else within him, finally snapped. His hands suddenly latching onto Hera's hips, and getting a surprised yelp from the goddess, as he spun him over, putting her flat on her back with her legs trapped between his, as he came up to his knees. Her breasts puffing out and wobbling over her chest as his face pulled away from the creamy envelopment and came to hover over hers as his arms bent with his hands planting down on the actual pillows of his bed on either side of her head. I'm getting real sick and tired of playing this little game with you, Hera. Beerus growled, forcing down the damn blush of arousal that threatened to surface as he glared down at her almost comically. First it was that bloody kiss that you called payback, then there was your blasted flirting with me while sparring, and now this. Bringing me to bed and staying with me while cuddled up naked, and expecting me to believe that you couldn't leave because of having to extricate me from you, when we both know damn well you could have just dematerialized away if you wanted to. Hera's cheeks blushed as Beerus leaned his face down a little further, leaving less than a quarter of a foot space between his and hers with almost a snarl, as his hot breath washing over her blemishless skin. Do you really enjoy teasing me that much that you're willing to go this far for it, just to get a reaction out of me? Is that it? Feeling his irksome genitalia twitching through the stretching fabric of his tunic as it rested and prodded over her midriff now, the god glanced down at it before shooting his gaze back up to her face with irritation as his eyes bored through her startled hazel pools. Or is it that you're the one that is actually smitten here, and this is your latest bold attempt to get me aroused enough to reciprocate in a much more physical manner? At this, Hera gawped, her cheeks flaring an even deeper shade of red as she looked almost aghast. What? She all but squawked like a bird that had been caught out, before she let out a shaky laugh clearly intended to be derisive, but came across more anxious than anything else. That's preposterous. I could never be smitten with you, she exclaimed, though even with her pride in full effect, the statement felt flimsy to her, as she placed her hands on his shoulders, unintentionally feeling out his muscles as she made to keep him at bay. Or at least, that's what she told herself anyway. And also, I'm not interested in getting physically intimate with anyone unless they're willing to marry me, so I hope your thick-headed skull won't get any funny ideas now. Says the goddess who got into bed with me while naked and then had that little snuggle with my unconscious body for however long it's been. Beerus retorted, pretty sure he'd sensed a lie in her first statement, while being unable to detect one in the latter. Something that gave him a clearer idea of what she may really be after, and it didn't help his current mood one bit. If anything, it just made him even more vexed. You have quite the knack for getting under my skin, I'll give you that. But you should already be well aware of how ill-advised it is to aggravate me, Hera. Is that right? Hera breathed out, her look becoming challenging as her pride took hold, and she seemed to recover from the surprise of what Beerus had done, gaining better control of her voice. Are you threatening me now for staying here to keep you company? She managed to regain her grin from before. That's quite crass, even by your standards. Attempting to cow me for showing you compassion like this. She let out a scoff, as she met his gaze right back with her typical defiance. What are you going to do, use that sword of yours on me? You don't have the heart to bring that kind of destruction upon me for something like this, no matter what you may say. She was daring enough to lean herself up then, bringing her forehead to touch his, practically daring him to try something with her confrontational demeanor, as her divine heart raced faster. This position exciting her far more than even she would have expected, as she continued confidently. And I assure you, whatever you choose to do, I can retaliate just as hard. The more rational part of Beerus wanted to either smack her or get up and leave in exasperation at her irksome behavior, or both, as he heard this. Another voice within him railed against either though, and Beerus found himself listening to it in this instance, as he felt that doing one or both of those would be a reaction she was looking for. No doubt emboldening her further, claiming she'd struck a nerve, and use it as further ammunition against him for her infernal teasing. There was little question, after what she'd pulled thus far, that was exactly what she'd do in that scenario, gaining her latest maddening victory over him. If she thought that's how this was going to go this time, she was about to get a rude awakening. Nothing else to add, dear brother. You seem to have got an awfully key Hera. That mouth of yours really does like to bark on, doesn't it? The god of destruction said, as he cut Hera off by clamping a hand around her jaw, pressing his fingers deep into her cheeks and forcing her lips to purse out almost like a duck, as his scowl turned into a half smirk. Perhaps it was the cloud he could feel having formed over his mind with how damnably aroused his body was, but Beerus decided it was about time to flip the script, so to speak. And as for your prior claims, I'm afraid you're mistaken on both accounts. Woo. The younger deity managed out through a somewhat strained jaw, as she grabbed Beerus's wrist. All she could do was hold onto it though, as Beerus's arm didn't so much as twitch from its position. The male deity rose up then, his knees still laid out either side of her legs as his pelvis pushed up, and his other hand flew down to the part of his tunic obscuring the stout, jutting part of his anatomy pressing through the fabric. If I really, truly want to do something to you, Hera, then make no mistake. There's not a damn thing you could do to stop me. He spoke clearly, confidently, and with a hint of huskiness that wasn't typically there, as he grabbed the lower part of his tunic. An action that she didn't fail to miss. And right now, I don't have many qualms with using this sword of mine on you, if you keep up this act of yours. Why you're bluffing, Hera's heart rate quickened further at his claim. Surely, that was the case, right? That had to be a bluff. Given how he'd been before, such a statement didn't line up with how he really was, from what she'd observed. As much as that other side of her she didn't show him wanted it to be true, there was no way what he was saying now was true. And her prideful side latched onto this line of thinking quick, as her expression became more defiant. Why you were falling over yourself and losing it over that kiss I gave not too long ago, because you don't do well with physical affection, and you expect me to believe you're willing to take it to that level against me. Hera managed a confident smirk of her own through the duck face Beerus's hand was forcing her beatific features to make. I don't care what threat you make, you don't even have the guts to kiss me, let alone use your dick on me. She remarked challengingly, not at all heeding his warning. And under normal circumstances, she would have been spot on, as her brother wasn't the kind of guy who was interested in that sort of thing, and moreover, Beerus himself would have agreed he wasn't the affectionate sort who took well to intimate or sexual matters, as it just wasn't his thing. And it never would have been in Universe 7 with his old body. Now though, this was most certainly not a normal circumstance, and Beerus was not only at his wit's end, both with her and his own body, but also in a situation where he believed he couldn't back down, as Hera would take such a concession and run a light year with it. Which meant there was only one way this could go, at least, as far as his heated mind could consider. Bluffing her. The purple-haired god mouthed, as he tilted her head upwards. His eyes like slits as the restraint he had on his body waned, and he proceeded to do something that Hera wasn't prepared for. Taking a page out of her and, to an extent, Demeter's own playbook. MMRPHR. Hera's eyes shot wider than they ever had before, total shock flooding through her divine system as Beerus leaned down, and faster than the blink of an eye, his lips pressed down on hers. The move from him of all people leaving Hera so stunned, that she offered no resistance when he ended up forcing her back down. The back of her head pushing down into one of his bed's pillows, her luscious hair splaying out over it and beneath her, as she was the one put into an unexpected lip lock this time. Having no idea what he was doing, seeing as this was the first time he'd ever initiated something like this himself, Beerus for once just allowed his new body's instincts to take hold of the driver's seat for him, and do exactly what Hera had done when she caught him with his mouth open. He pressed his vengeful, hungered lips deeper into hers and slipped his larger tongue past the rosy red borders of her feminine maw, pushing his slippery slab inside her hot, moist cavern in one go. MMRLPH. Hera's pupils shrunk smaller than pinpricks, her eyes almost looking completely whited out as her face exploded the deepest shade of red. Her body finally beginning to wriggle beneath him futilely, as heat exploded throughout. One hand gripping tightly on his shoulder while the other began tapping against his back, as if half-heartedly telling him to stop and try to get out from under him. There was nowhere for her to go though. She was so dumbstruck by his sudden smooch that she forgot she still had the ability to teleport, or turn herself into something else to escape. What did escape was an uncontrollable moan as his organ darted around her mouth, aggressively and thirstily exploring her depths. The meaty slab running across her gums, pushing through her tunnel far enough damn near to reach her tonsils, as it slapped and dragged along the floor and ceiling of her fleshy tunnel. Its jerking movements like that of a wild beast tussling with its prey for dominance before it went in for the kill. Her vulnerable, lither tongue acting as the neck getting trapped between the mighty animal's jaws in that analogy, as his began grappling with hers, savagely wrestling it about with more brute power than any sort of finesse. This was, certainly a new experience for the destroyer god. One that, surprisingly, wasn't as cringe-inducing for him as he might have thought. That voice that had once rung loud in his head not too long ago when either Demeter or Hera had kissed him, about how repulsive a scene like this should have been to him, was now but only the smallest of whispers that went ignored by his hazy mind. Drowned out by a new, more carnal side of him, which had gone mostly ignored up to now, taking a good deal of pleasure in doing this, and unsurprisingly, wanted him to go further. His self-control, which was never that good to begin with, was practically hanging on by a thread thanks to Hera's antics. What he was currently feeling, which was almost like a raging inferno within him, was similar to the dopamine rush he got whenever he tasted a new, delicious kind of food, in that it made him want even more. Rather than just go along with that instinct right away, however, Beerus would soon pull back from the kiss. A long strand of saliva connecting their lips thanks to his messy tongue action, and would remain there as Hera's mouth gaped like a fish at what he'd just done, despite the grip of his hand no longer straining her jaw at that point. His eyes peering down at the look of deep astoundment plastered on her heavily red features, and feeling the hot, somewhat more labored breaths against his skin as she stared up at him with the widest eyes that he'd ever seen on her. "You were warned," he growled, feeling an odd sense of accomplishment from what he'd just done, as he decided to take it a step further. FFFFFFFFWWWWISH. The sound of Beerus's tunic flashing with a whitish golden aura that rustled the cloth audibly reached her ears, before suddenly the whole thing vanished off of the god's body right before her eyes. In that moment, forget butterflies, a marching band might as well have been stomping about in her stomach, as her dinner plate wide eyes that remained from Beerus's kiss, saw her older brother completely in the buff. The poor goddess, not even remotely recovered from the shell-shocking act of him willingly snogging her, was then given a front-row seat to ogle Athos' hard, defined six-pack abs along with his broad, well-muscled chest and pecs, framing well with his remarkably muscled arms and legs. "Still think I'm bluffing you?" Beerus part grunted, part growled, as he pulled further back and rose to his feet upon the bed, using his grip over her face to pull Hera upright on her ass. Her hands instinctively planting themselves on his thighs, as her stupefied, velvet red face was brought mere inches away from his pelvic region, her naked breasts jostling and jiggling from the motion. His hand then pulled away from her jaw and grabbed over her head and hair. His body remaining hunched over, as his rigid, towering member casted a wide shadow over her gawping face. Oh my word, Hera's dazed mind finally thought, as she now found herself dangerously close to Beerus's third leg. Her still frazzled head finding it hard to process its full size, now no longer held in by the fabric of his cloth, being so big, that she had to tilt her eyes all the way up just to see its bulbous head still peeking up past her vision. The bloody monster of a thing easily as thick as his wrist, and riddled with stressful veins that looked ready to pop from intense strain after being hard for so long with arousal. A pair of testicles below it between his exposed, thickly muscled thighs that were about the size of a clenched fist each, swollen up in a way that looked downright painful. "You know how much I hate to repeat myself, Hera, but I'll ask again since you clearly didn't hear me. Does this look like a bluff to you?" Beerus snarled, not even sure himself if it even was a bluff anymore, as it had been initially intended. He was that heated right now, and not in the angered way he was used to feeling like at all. "Rabh. Hera only stared goggle-eyed, her speech coming out like gibberish from her now slack-jawed, comically flawed expression the likes of which Beerus had not seen in a very long time, and certainly not for a scenario like this. Her mind clearly still reeling hard from him effectively pulling a 180 on how he normally acted. And in all honesty, had Beerus been in his normal frame of mind, he would have bust a nut laughing at how stupefied she looked. Now though, for the first time, counting even his original life, he may very well be one small push away from coming down on someone in a very different manner to how he'd done before. Vaguely, he understood he was most likely escalating this much more than he should have. That the kiss alone was far enough out of the comfort zone of what he would normally do in a situation like this, but at the moment, he was past caring. If she wanted to pull this kind of salacious game on him, which unfortunately worked due to his current body being built different from his old one, then he'd pull it himself, and in a more aggressive manner like this to ward off any further antics from her. Reverse psychology, hitting her with a behavior she didn't expect and clearly wasn't prepared for. HMPH. You starting to understand now? Hera swallowed hard and audibly, looking like she was ready to choke, as Beerus spoke down to her. His gaze becoming more treacherous than it should for a brief moment, focusing on each and every curve of her perfect, naked body, in a similar, but more perverse vein to what he did with an incredible-looking piece of food he'd just been introduced to. The god's eyes twitched as he forced them to stop doing that when the instincts of his new body screamed at him to do away with restraint and just go for it now. Something which he resisted, though with much greater difficulty than before, as his glare down at her intensified. No more funny business, Hera. Consider this your last warning. If you aggravate me like this again, on purpose, in any way, then the kiss I just gave you will be nothing compared to the action I take next. How? Speech still failing her, Hera flinched when she saw that monster casting a shadow over her twitch, her eyes barely meeting Beerus's own past the slab of meat he had exposed over her face. Her mind all the while, still utterly rattled to its core at everything that had just happened. The goddess' thoughts whirring at 1,000,000 miles per second, trying to see if this wasn't just some highly lucid dream of hers. One in which her brother, who always did pulley with extra affectionate motions, had just initiated an even deeper and lustful kiss on her, before stripping himself naked and presenting her with his penis, while making it clear he was willing to fuck her. The longer her mind did this though, the clearer it became that this was no dream. This was real. And her brother was eyeing her like a predator to pounce on its prey, and she was but mere inches away from an enormous python that could be shoved down her throat or other orifices at any moment. An internal war commenced within Hera in that moment. The less prideful side being excited at this development, seeing that Beerus was more willing than ever at this moment, regardless of the reason, to get intimate with her, and wanted to take the risk of proposing marriage to him. Because while there was a solid chance he could reject the idea, given how inflamed he was at the minute, he'd probably be much more malleable to the idea than he otherwise would be, and thus, she might actually be able to coax him into accepting it. Then all the teasing could end, all the tiptoeing and sidestepping could stop, and she could just cut loose, as could he. Her prideful side got in the way though, railing against the idea and wanting nothing more than to be out of this situation, before it escalated further. Not wanting to take such a risk and put herself in that kind of vulnerable position to him, effectively admitting to his face that she wanted him. Especially not when he could reject the idea wholesale and then, given his current mood, potentially strip her of her chastity regardless, which was a truly harrowing thought. Staring up into Beerus's amber pools, and seeing just how blazing his eyes were, Hera hesitated. Her lips parted to speak, to push aside her pride and propose that which she desired, but nothing came. She would try again, only to whimper underneath his smoldering stare, the heat permeating her quivering body intensifying beyond dizzying heights, her mind only just now becoming aware of the extreme dampness between her thighs as she subconsciously closed them. Nervous sweat peeling down from her heavenly skin as she tried to force herself to speak one last time. Beerus watched as Hera clamped her eyes shut, grit her teeth, and without uttering another word, her body glowed gold before quickly dissipating into countless specks, as she teleported out from under his grip, leaving him by himself within his own room, as the goddess scent lingered. His eyes not failing to notice the wet patch on his sheets where the gorgeous goddess had been sat by him. Well, that settles that then, I guess, he sighed, part of him glad she was gone, while another, much larger part, feeling a strange amount of disappointment. Though he quickly chalked that up to his body not liking that it couldn't get its rocks off with her, as given how absurdly aroused his body was, it was the only thing that made sense to him. Speaking of which, Beerus, amber pools dropped down to his throbbing member, as the hand that had been holding Hera's head grabbed it just below the tip. He'd still have to deal with this as soon as possible. It and the fire built up inside him wouldn't go away on their own, as was proven by this stubborn body of his keeping this erection for several days whilst he was unconscious. And he sure as shit was not putting up with it so long as he could help it. The sounds of footsteps fastly approaching his room's entrance were quick to interrupt his thoughts from this for the moment, as his attention turned to the doorway. A flash of long, straw-blonde hair swishing before his vision on the edge of the doorway, before a very familiar goddess seemingly skidded to a stop in front of it. Her grassy green tunic fluttering in the soft, pure wind of Olympus from how fast she must have moved, ample breasts jiggling within their confines as her dainty hands gripped the sides of his bedroom entrance. "Be brother," Demeter exclaimed, sounding overjoyed, and looking it, as her olive eyes lit up with glee seeing him up and about. "You're finally awake," her voice quickly petered off though as she fully took him in. Beerus watching on as, like Hera, her eyes widened, cheeks flared red and her jaw dropped upon registering that he wasn't wearing anything. "Demeter. What's wrong? Why have you?" The form of Hestia appeared behind her sister, a look of concern briefly appearing over her face as she caught up to the younger sibling, wondering why she'd paused so oddly. That was until her eyes too peered into the room over the other goddess' shoulder, and she caught full sight of exactly what had stunned the blonde into temporary speechlessness. Oh. Beerus didn't think he'd ever seen so much color appear on Hestia's features all at once, as she along with Demeter caught every intimate detail of his nude, muscular form. His gaze not failing to notice where both sets of stunned eyes fell to after giving him a once-over, zoning in on the erect, hulking pillar he had so willingly exposed and held on to and what was dangling beneath like they were put in a trance. The eldest sister, unlike the younger blonde, snapped herself out of it just as fast as she'd gone into it. An embarrassed blush seeping further over her beautiful face as she ripped her eyes away from a package she hadn't been expecting to see, idly noting Hera's lack of presence anymore, as she met Beerus's bemused gaze with her own. My dearest brother, I see you've risen," she coughed and winced, realizing herself how awkward that sentence sounded in this context. A smile of both relief and awkwardness painting her lips eventually, as she gently nudged Demeter's shoulder, getting the latter to partially snap out of their own trance. "Have you we arrived at a bad time." Beerus felt some light concern inwardly when no knee-jerk embarrassment hit him from being seen naked by those he hadn't meant to flash, given the multiple times he'd accidentally done so to Whis in the past and swiftly sought to hide his genitalia. Especially given one of the people seeing him exposed was Hestia, and that fact should have made him much more uncomfortable. Instead, he had to firmly slap down the perverse thought and feeling his damned body and murky mind gave to turn his flared carnal urges unto his other two sisters. Something which without the repulsion he'd felt mentally before he'd been let in on why his body acted the way it did toward his sisters in more sexual situations, was, like with Hera, much more challenging than he'd like. Tearing his cock off like he'd done last time didn't seem appropriate in front of the two, though, even if it would work and his genitals would just instantly regenerate anyway. Plus, his body instinctually rebelled against the notion far more than it did that time, and he got the odd sense that if he tried anyway, whether they were here or not, he wouldn't be able to. Left with little other option, and wanting to get over this so he could get back to what would be more pressing matters, like all the happenings on since he'd been out of commission, Beerus went with the first thing to pop into his head to resolve this. One that didn't involve him making a move on either goddess before him, as he cleared his throat. You've come at a good time, actually. If you two wouldn't mind, I'd like you to get going and let the others know I'm awake on my behalf. I'll be out in the courtyard with you in a bit. Alright, will do, brother. Hestia nodded, cheeks still burning red as hell as she smiled at him a bit more tensely than usual, doing everything she could to not look down below his waist, as she grabbed Demeter by both shoulders. See, come along, sister. Let's do as he asked, she said hurriedly, as she went to pull the blonde away from the doorway. Demeter, as though finally snapping out of her own trance, resisted being jerked away. Her fingers digging into the frame hard enough almost to crack it, as she whipped her head back toward Hestia in alarm. What? No, wait. Let's not be hasty, sister. Can't I? No. Hestia came close to squawking, knowing where the younger sibling was going there. It was far too obvious, in fact. Hestia chalking up the reason why she cared about that in this situation, to her simply wanting to honor her brother's wishes, who clearly wanted to be left alone. Yeah, that had to be it. Oh, our dearest brother is clearly in the middle of something important right now. Best leave him to it. But what if he needs some? Demeter started, turning back to look in the room, only to see that Beerus was no longer there. All that remained was a few specks of gold trickling down to the bed sheets, briefly lighting up the quilt near a now more visible wet patch for the blonde goddess. Help.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like this video if you want some more what if video. Comment 3 hearts for more what